Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're absolutely delighted to see you here today in such large numbers, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our annual London Funds Conference, A Tale of Two Cities. Just 18 months ago, the collapse of Lehman Brothers heralded the biggest bankruptcy in US history, and also triggered the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Failure or instability followed for many more institutions and culminated in the April 2009 G20 calling for all systemically important financial institutions, markets and instruments to be subject to an appropriate degree of regulation and oversight. Principles-based regulation was in the dock, and work began on building the new rulebooks. The EU Commission subsequently issued proposals which would introduce a new regulatory framework for alternative investment fund managers. Alongside a raft of requirements, the directive would introduce a single market passport with possible extension to third countries only after a transitional phase of 3 years and subject to equivalence tests. And so, the AIFM Directive first exploded onto all our horizons, and with 1,700 amendments tabled to date, has proven to be one of the most hotly debated and controversial pieces of financial services legislation ever to come out of the EU. But the 2009 April G20 communiqué also addressed the overriding need to ensure free markets can function effectively. And indeed also that protectionist tendencies must be avoided at all costs. I quote, "Reinvigorating world trade and investment is essential for restoring global growth. We will not repeat the historic mistakes of protectionism of previous eras. It appears that one of the consequences of a directive which has the potential to lock out non-EU funds would be a reduction in the flow of investment funds and mobile capital into the European Union." Given the commitment to free trade in the April communiqué, this aspect of the directive does seem to be at odds with the spirit of the G20 meeting. Geithner, US Treasury Secretary, writing to EU Commissioner Michel Barnier, flags this very issue in a letter dated March 1st, 2010. One issue which the US and EU have discussed over the last several months is the regulation of the alternative investment fund management industry. In this area and in others, I believe we agree that it is essential to fulfill our G20 commitment to avoid discrimination and maintain a level playing field. Geithner goes on to express a strong desire to see access to the EU maintained for US firms, and contrasts the directive proposals with the open markets approach of the US. The first salvo in a financial services trade war? Well, let's sincerely hope not. The igniting of a meaningful debate about how the EU interfaces with third countries and how to achieve common recognition of regulatory standards, the management of risk, and investor protection is in everyone's best interests. Jersey's finance industry is host to many alternative fund managers, administrators and custodians, including some of the largest players in Europe. Over 4,000 people work in our funds sector. We welcome this debate, and our industry is keen to contribute. Our government has engaged with the EU authorities with a view to exploring how we might work collaboratively to achieve the twin aims of sound, effective regulation and open markets. We are confident that we already meet equivalent standards, given our status as the leading offshore centre in the Global Financial Centres Index, our long-standing commitment to international regulatory standards, successive satisfactory IMF reviews, including recently the highest ratings ever achieved by any jurisdiction, and our cooperative and transparent stance, evidenced by our immediate inclusion on the OECD whitelist. Whatever the outcome, the Jersey finance industry remains confident that it will continue to make a valuable contribution to the alternative funds industry in Europe and globally, and remains an attractive proposition for fund managers, administrators, and custodians. And so to the debate. Our conference coincides with dramatic developments with respect to consideration of the directive, now deferred by Econ, allegedly following direct intervention by Gordon Brown and Nicolas Sarkozy. We have assembled a panel of experts in their respective fields for our debate, and we will begin with presentations by Mr. Charlie McCreevy, until recently EU Commissioner for the Internal Market, and by Mr. Brendan McMahon, Global Private Equity Leader, PwC. The presentations will then be followed by a panel debate by our speakers, and I'm delighted to confirm that this will be facilitated by Mr. Michael Wilson of Sky News and GMTV fame, undoubtedly one of British television's premier business commentators. Our final panellist will be Mr. Martin DeForest Brown, Director of International Finance for the States of Jersey. Martin is the senior civil servant in the Jersey government responsible for finance and has been actively engaged with the EU on third country representation, and in a previous life was employed for a time by the 3i Group. The presentations and panel session will then be followed by concluding remarks from Mr. Richard Thomas, President of the Jersey Funds Association, who will close the formal session and invite you to stay on for drinks, which follow. And so to our first speaker. We are delighted and honoured that Mr. Charlie McCreevy has kindly agreed to address the conference. Charlie McCreevy was born in 1949 and after completing a degree in commerce at Dublin University, qualified as a chartered accountant. In 1977, he was first elected to the Irish Parliament for his home constituency, County Kildare. From 1992, he held various cabinet posts in Fianna Fáil-led governments, including Minister for Social Welfare, Minister for Tourism and Trade, and latterly in 1997, Minister for Finance. In 2004, he resigned his seat to become a member of the European Commission. He was appointed to the Internal Market and Services portfolio by President of the Commission, José Barroso.